we have an episode about a little mountain town in Colorado known as Vail and the resort that lies within. Today, we're going to have a little discussion where we bring on Claire's dad to talk about the earliest days of Vail, what it looked like in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then we're going to talk about our experience growing up in the valley.
Yes, it's going to get a little bit spicy, I think. There's going to be some kind of hot takes, some opinions. Maybe you'll kind of see a different side of us that you haven't seen yet, or maybe that you weren't expecting. So I'm really excited to get into it because Vail is definitely a place that people are usually familiar with, right? They kind of at least have heard of it, know that it's in Colorado, that it's some sort of mysterious ski town. That something's going on there.
Something's a brewing.
Yes, but if you didn't know, that's where Brendan and I grew up. I was born there. You weren't, but you spent
some time there.
Yeah, more than half of your adult of your child life there.
Yes.
So it's quite a substantial part of our identity, and we kind of want to peel back the curtain a little bit and talk about some of the controversies. Yeah, just our honest review, more or less, of Vail. And so if that sounds interesting to you, stick with us. So before we bring in my dad, the expert that we've decided to talk about on this case, let's talk about what Vail is and where it is. So it is a little mountain town in Colorado. It has a very high elevation. What is it?
8,150.
All right. So for anyone who lives at sea level, it's up there. It's a high altitude place to live. It's a resort town, very, very small, all year population. But then during ski season, it more than quadruples.
Yes.
And so it's kind of a funky place to grow up. And I wanted to talk to my dad specifically about what Vail used to look like, because I think many of us kind of have a picture of what Vail and or Aspen, if that's something you know of, looks like and kind of who it caters to. But there's more to the story. There's history there that I think is really important in grounding this story. So, without further ado, let's get into our interview. All right. Hi, we have my dad on the line. Hi, Dad. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, well, hi, Claire. Hi, Brendan. Yes, I'm Claire's dad.
Can you tell the story of my grandfather coming out to Vail for the first time and what that was like, kind of what he thought of it?
My dad and mom, they actually had built a ski lodge in Stowe in Vermont, and that was in that was the late 50s. It was 55 through 59, and that was a kind of a tough time there. That's all pre-snowmaking, and the ski business was very much tied to how much snow the mountain was getting.
Right.
But they had a ski lodge, and they ran that for those years. And then my dad was very involved with skiing back in New England at the time. Now, when I say skiing, it was primarily cross-country skiing. Although we had the ski lodge, and they relied on tourists to come and ski in Stowe. Later on, he was thinking about he getting back into the ski business because he got out of Stowe and he had a restaurant in New York, and he thought, well, I want to go out to Colorado because as a kid in Finland, and that's where my parents came from, they immigrated. He read Zane Grey novels and he loved cowboys, and he thought, well, let's go take a little trip out to Colorado. And of course, being in the ski business, he knew various people who were involved here, both in cross-country skiing and in alpine skiing. So he came out to visit some friends in Aspen. with the whole idea of, let's see, maybe I can get back into the ski business. So they came out to Aspen. This was in 1962, and he looked around there, and of course, it's a beautiful town and great mountain there, and he was thinking, it's just so darn expensive here.
Mm.
It's just not going to work out. So his friend said, well, why don't you go check Steamboat? And my dad actually knew some cross country skiers up there in Steamboat. And at that time, Steamboat was heavily into Nordic skiing because they had the ski jump there at Holliston Hill.
Right.
So he went up to Steamboat and looked around, and he goes, nah, it's still kind of expensive. Not sure, this is going to work. So they said, well, George, why don't you go check this new place? It's called Vail, and they're just trying to get started. There's not a whole lot there, but there's some people who are involved in the 10th Mountain Division from the Camp Hale.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you go over there and check that out? So my dad, mom, they drove from Steamboat Springs and came to the Vail Valley and met some people there. And the people they met go, George, we are so excited that you're here. Let us show you around. And so they kind of, got the little tour of, and there wasn't much there at the time, and looked around and said, right here, why don't you build your ski lodge right here? And so my dad kind of looked around, and that location, that was called Golden Peak.
Right.
And that's it's just really off the center of town, but it's really where things are happening today. Well, in those days, there was nothing but a bunch of deer and elk walking around and not much else. And so my dad kind of looked around, and, he'd been disappointed in Aspen, and he was disappointed in Steamboat. He looked around and looked here, and he said, I don't think so. I said, there'll never be anything here. And so then, so then he left, and we moved to Colorado Springs, and he bought a motel. So it's kind of a sad story. Although we did come back to Vail in '72. So it was 10 years later.
Yeah. So that kind of gives an idea of what Vail was kind of right before, in the 60s, right before it started becoming something. I remember you always told me how, it was dirt roads and barely any people lived there. And like within the valley, there were already kind of established towns, and Vail was kind of nothing. And so I just remember you telling me that story as a kid, and how, it's funny to me. I can see how disappointing it was looking back, but it's just kind of a weird little story. So I'm glad that you could share that, because I think it's a good story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you went back in the 70s. So can you tell us a little bit about what Vail was like at that time? Because it still hadn't quite become the resort it is today, of course. And I wondered if you could talk about what the overall feeling and vibe of Vail was in the 70s when you lived there with your mom.
Well, no, in the '70s, my parents actually moved to Vail at '72. Now, I was in college at CSU in Fort Collins at that time, and so I'd come home sometimes on the weekends, and at that time there was no Eisenhower Tunnel, so coming from the Front Range and coming from Fort Collins, you had to drive over Loveland Pass. And it was a long drive, and in those days, driving on Vail Pass was just 2 lane. And sometimes when it was really really bad winter kind of driving, they would have the Charlie Gate, and they'd put the Charlie Gate down, and that's when they had the chain law where they actually inspected your tires to see if you had snow tires.
Right.
Otherwise, they sometimes they wouldn't even let you over the pass. Sometimes it would be so bad that coming from the Denver side, it would be local traffic only. So you had to show your license to say, oh, no, I actually live in Vail. And so then they would let you through. Sometimes when, going over Vail Pass when it was really, really snowy, they'd have like one snowplow and you'd have to follow that. And when it was really, really bad, it was just four-wheel drive or front-wheel drive. And in those days, there were only a couple of front-wheel drive cars, and that's kind of when Audi became kind of popular,
Mm,
with a lot of the locals, because you had better traction.
right.
So, yeah. Um, but coming into Vail, then in those early days, you would come to, well, right now it's the roundabout. It's the main exit that you come off I-70, and you're coming into Vail. And now it's it's a couple of roundabouts actually. But in those days, it was just a four-way stop sign.
Yeah.
And, you come off the highway and then the parking there for the ski area was just a dirt lot where the um, structure is now. There at that time, there was no Lion's Head yet. That was just getting started, and they were just building the building for what was going to be the gondola at Lion's Head. But there was really nothing much down there yet. They were just starting to build those condos and build up what was to be called Lion's Head. But in the early days when we, were in town, that kind of thing, we would laugh because people who lived up in Eastvale, that was like way out of town. That was right at the base
Well, it still kind
of
of is.
well, yeah, but yeah, that's true. Um, but that was up there, when Vail Pass was coming down to the highway there. And then Westvale, that was also out of town, and that's kind of where we lived. Um, and in those early days, there was no grocery store there. There was just the village market, which was right in town, and of course, people would shop there. But most of the locals would do, big grocery shopping, and that was you had to go to Leadville, to the Safeway up there. Um, so, driving around in those days, you had to have good tires.
Hmm.
Um, and, some of the old timers now complain about the roads becoming, they have to salt everything. And in the old days, we used to say that, they would plow and they'd put down cinders, and the roads were in much better shape and they weren't as slippery as sometimes they are today. Of course, the traffic was much less too. You didn't have to deal with the traffic like you do now. Um, but it was fun. It was a fun place. It had a very European atmosphere to it in the early days. Um, a lot of the hotel owners and restaurant people and even the service people who lived there, a lot of them were Europeans. There were a lot of Germans and Austrians and Swiss. Uh, and so my parents felt like they always fit right in, to the early Vail scene.
Right.
Um, so it was a lot of fun in those early days. So
I think, today Vale kind of gets criticized for having this fake Austrian or Swiss kind of look to it, right? The Vale Village is very done up and you kind of feel like you're somewhere in Europe, but you're not. You're in Colorado. And I just wanted to remind people out there that, like, originally Vale was founded and kind of settled and started with Europeans. It isn't now, right? It's all commercial landowning. It's very different, but it does look like that for a reason. And yes, it's great to criticize and kind of wonder why it's changed, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But there's a foundation there that it was made to look a certain way because of the people who lived there, because they weren't in their home countries anymore. They were in the United States for various reasons. And like you said, my grandparents felt probably more accepted and more at home with those people in that community.
yeah, and my parents often talked about that. They felt very much at home in Vail, and because of that. And when they left Vermont Vermont was for them was very, very different, because there were only really at that time really sort of two European families in Stowe. And when my parents built a ski lodge there, there was another ski lodge there, and all the other people who lived in the village, they were just New England people, and Vermonters were, there's just a different culture there.
Right.
And so my parents always felt a little bit like outsiders there, in Stowe. But then, they had their very good friends, and we spent a lot of time with the Von Trapps, and that was kind of nice. So,
Yeah, there's a fun
um,
little fun fact there.
yeah. So yeah, actually, the oldest daughter that you see in the movie in The Sound of Music, she was my kindergarten teacher, because the Von Trapps were struggling at that time to get started in the ski business, just like my parents were in those early days in Vermont.
So you and my grandmother, your mom, spent some time working with a family in Vail.
Yes,
Can you speak a
yes.
little bit about, first of all, when that was and what that experience was like, and again, what the feeling of Vail was at that time, because it's kind of going through certain evolutions here. Like it's starting to pick up speed, there's more investment, tourism becomes a little bit higher. What do you notice as someone who's lived in Vail for a very long time? What does it feel like in that era?
Yeah. I actually had the opportunity to work with my mother. We worked for a family that had a property right in the center of town, and we essentially, took care of them. My mom did. She cooked for the family and for their guests, and he was, he was a wealthy person, and he had a lot of guests who he would bring out. Um, Primarily to ski, primarily for vacation. Although we he did conduct some business there. Um, but in those early days, this was in the early '80s now, and we were living in town, and town was becoming, um, I would say, more developed. There were more lodges. Golden Peak was really starting to get built up. Um, there was a lot more going on in Westvale. We had a big grocery store there, down in Westvale, and there was more population. More people were building vacation homes there, and so the whole area was really, really growing. Um, Vail Pass had finally got 4 lanes pushed through. I
Finally.
70, yeah, I-70 was now complete all the way from Denver, all the way through Glenwood Springs. Now, in those early days when we first lived there, I-70 stopped, just a little bit past Georgetown. Um, well, it actually stopped right where the tunnel bore is, because it stopped at Loveland Pass. The tunnel hadn't been built yet. Um, Vail Pass was still 2 lane. Even when you came through Summit County, you had to drive over the uh, road that goes over the dam of Dillon Lake. There was no interstate there yet at that time. There was a stretch of 4 lane highway from Vail to Eagle, but going through Glenwood Canyon. That still was 2 lanes. So that didn't come until much later. But by that time in the early '80s, that had all become complete, and so that allowed traffic then,
Hmm.
to come from Denver, and ski business was growing in Colorado. Yeah, many times when guests would come in, they would stay for a week. That was sort of typical, and they would come into the airport, um, sometimes in Denver, and then they would, ride a shuttle or a rental car up. Oftentimes, it was coming in to the Eagle Airport, and we'd pick them up. But many of the guests that my boss had really enjoyed coming to stay at the house. And our house, then what we did is we moved from a condo that we had at the center of the village to, we had a house that was just really off the very center. It was right there on Hanson Ranch Road. And so it was basically ski in and ski out. So it was, it was easy for the tourists. But when people came to stay in the house, uh, my mom, she just knew how to take care of people. Her cooking was, people still try to describe it to this day. They don't quite understand how she could make something out of almost nothing. But they just enjoyed being there. We put, really good meals on the table at dinner time, and there was plenty of stuff there for breakfast and lunch, and it was just kind of, it was a warm feeling in the house, and I think it came from partly that, my parents knew how to run the ski lodge in Stowe. They were just very natural at it.
I think
Yeah.
it just speaks to the authenticity that you talk about that seems so prevalent in the early days of Vail that I think now today with just the high volume of tourism, people are trying to recreate and kind of grasp onto. But a lot of these original people, they're not around anymore. There's a few stragglers, but for the majority of them, they're gone. And
Yes. Yeah. And so when with that, um, you, all of the mountain towns up there have changed. Everything. Those people have come and gone.
are there any other stories you want to tell before we move on to the last question?
Well, this is a funny thing, because in the early days, now this goes back to the '70s when my family was living there, and if you remember, my dad he was big into Nordic skiing, and so my brothers and I, we of course had to have a good track to go out and train on and ski. So we skied on, at that time, what was the Vail golf course. But, a golf course being a golf course is rather flat, and cross country skiing goes, through over hills and up and down and that kind of thing. And my father was determined to, sort of lay kind of a kind of a course for us that we could use. And he had a snowmobile, of course. And so he went to the town and he said, I'd like to, I'd like to sort of put kind of a trail out here in Eastvale so that we can ski. And so people said, well, we're not sure about that. So then he went to the forest department down there in Minturn, and he said, I'd like to cut down some trees up there close to the golf course, and some of it's on national forest land. And I'd like to be able to do that so we can run a cross country trail through there. And so the guy kind of looked at me and says, yeah, no, that's no problem. Go ahead and cut down the trees that you need to cut. Well, I think my dad probably cut down, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 aspen trees there. And, in those days, he did it all with a handsaw and an axe.
Gosh.
Gee.
All by himself?
Yeah, well, no, he had, 3 sons to help him.
Oh, with you included.
Oh yeah. So, and during the summertime, we got that all kind of cut out, and then winter came, and of course the snows came, and he had his snowmobile, and we'd go through there and kind of make a nice cross country trail that started kind of, well, we started in Eastvale and then went towards the clubhouse at the golf course, and then kind of came back. Um, Turns out that cross country trail is still used today by the Nordic Center in Vail at the golf course,
I
because
didn't know that.
yeah, that
I've
was
never,
all,
I was
that's
gonna
one story
ask.
that I've never heard.
Yeah,
yeah, that was
because
all cut out by my dad. So he just followed
jeez.
some old dirt roads there, and made a few little adjustments, and you know that's how that got started.
The more
Wow.
you know.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Because I mean, now it's the Vail Golf Club in the summer, in the Vail Nordic Center in the winter. Like, and it's a very big Nordic center, and but that
Yeah,
bit of
yeah,
history, I mean, you don't know about it from just being, casually acquainted with it. So it's cool to hear because I mean, wondering where all the first trail cuts come from, and um, it, I like to learn about that, and who had the just crazy enough idea to go out there and do it.
I mean,
yeah. As a
someone
matter of
has to
fact,
do it,
Yeah.
right? Like,
yeah,
someone
yeah,
has to be scrappy enough to say, this is where we want to do it. This is the idea I have. And in the beginning of something, people can do that. That's how Vail was formed.
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. That's um, and a lot of the local people there, and there were many people who were skiing cross country, and they were using our track, and my father never cared unless you were in the way when he was coming by.
Oh my
And so then he
gosh.
would get the look, and it sort of got to the point where they would see, okay, if George is out there, you better stay away.
Yeah,
So
and well, if we can find a picture of him, we'll show it. But he was very Finnish, very stoic looking. I would be a little scared if I saw him out on the track and he was upset with me. So I'm sure people learned to stay away. But that's a really great story.
yeah, see now, by the time my dad came out to Colorado, he was already, kind of past um, a lot of the history in cross country skiing that was happening. Now, when they were back in New England, he was very instrumental with my godfather who lived in New York City, because these were all Finns who came from the old country, and they got skiing really going at Dartmouth and some of the other colleges up there, and so they were organizing cross country races all across New England and getting those ski teams organized there. As a matter of fact, my dad um, qualified for the 1960 Olympic team in cross country skiing for the United States, but he was unable to go because he wasn't a citizen at that time.
Right.
So, but then when he came out to Colorado, and we were living in Vail, and we were going to a lot of the organized cross country races around Colorado, and he was part of helping a lot of colleges with their training programs, and he and some other bigger names in cross country skiing at that time helped to organize training camps for the U.S. ski team. And when I say U.S. ski team now, I'm talking about the Nordic side, not the Alpine side. Um, and so he was still very, very active uh, with that, even in the early days.
So, how would you describe what Vail is like today, both in just kind of the tourism and how it feels, and maybe how that original purpose or feeling has been changed, maybe through what Vail Resorts has done and become, or just in a general atmospheric feeling?
Well, skiing changed. Um, Skiing changed with, uh, I think, first with the um, interest that people got. A lot of people who moved to Colorado and like lived on the Front Range and were coming up to the ski areas to ski. So there was a lot of interest there, and the ski business was growing. And then, of course, snowboarding came along, and that also uh, met the needs of some other people, a lot of younger people. Um, and then the equipment also changed, and that made it. Um, we used to say, some of the old timers used to say, well, that made skiing so easy because the new equipment made it easy for you to get on a pair of skis. But it didn't matter because you could get out there, and it's just the freedom of you know wind in your face coming down the mountain. Um, the um, scenery going by. It's just going over the terrain and through the snow. It's just a wonderful feeling. So yeah, it did change. It's busier now than it was. Um, there are probably more people on the mountain, but the mountain itself is quite a bit bigger.
Right.
I remember when I was working for that family in the early '80s. Um, the back bowls have always been infamous. You've got sun up and sundown, and then where China Bowl is today, and the Two Elk restaurant, that was just getting started. That wasn't quite there yet. And then the whole backside of what's called Blue Sky Basin, that was, there was nothing back there. That was all forest and open glades and that kind of thing. And that came much, much later. So Vail expanded a lot. But as many ski areas have, Aspen is larger and Steamboat is larger and you've got all of the skiing. It's changed a lot, but it's still fun to get out there.
No, definitely. I think the outdoors, the scenery hasn't changed. It's always going to be Vail because people want to go there for a reason, right? But I think it's kind of started to attract a different tourism audience, right? There's very, very wealthy people that come there regularly, or wealthy people who have moved and have, second or third homes. And, that adds a whole new dimension to the way that the Vail Valley even operates. We looked up today what a day pass ticket is. What's your guess on how much a day pass ski ticket is in Vail?
Oh boy, now. Well, it was like $30 when I was skiing, years ago.
It's $300.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For a day.
For a day pass.
Wow. When I was in college and came home in the early '70s, and sometimes I'd bring some of my, college buddies with me. We knew some of the people in ski school and the supervisors there, and they would let us sidestep international and giant steps when it was full of snow because they didn't have the ability to snowcat those in the early days. They couldn't winch the snowcats, but they wanted to get that snow packed down a little bit, so people could start skiing. So we'd sidestep for a few hours, and then they'd give us a couple of passes for the weekend.
That sounds nice. That's definitely not happening anymore. Maybe if you're lucky, someone on the inside.
Yeah, no, they of course they do some pretty incredible snowcatting now.
Sure, it's just when we talk about $30 ski pass back in the day, I don't think you can really get that anywhere. Anymore, anyway. But 300 is absurd, right? That's not accessible to the average American family. That's what I mean when Vail is now designed and built to cater to, wealthy tourists. And so to me, growing up, it kind of brought in a weird vibe because, I always felt at home at Vail. I connected to it because that's where my family was, and that's where I lived. But there's always this feeling in the air that there's a divide between kind of the people on one side of the valley versus the other. And I get the sense that didn't exist in Vail in the olden days. And to me, that's a product of Vail Resorts kind of commercializing the area. So I just wanted to, have you on so that you could share with people that, Vail used to be a different way than what it is now. And it's interesting to look at why that happened.
Well, yeah, for instance, you talk about ski passes.
Yeah.
When I was teaching in the early days and students would get a season pass for the school year, and if you were a student in E County, you could get the season pass, and teachers could as well. Guess what that costs?
I couldn't even begin. Like
$50.
Close, 25.
Oh my gosh!
No.
Yeah.
You can't
Really?
even probably get like a hot chocolate and a donut for $25 in Vail
You can't
anymore.
even look at a lodge for $25.
Right, because the ski pass is one part of being able to be at Vail. Then there's the lodging, is going to be upwards of 1,000 a night. Then you have the dining and eating and the renting of your gear and the shopping. And so if anyone's ever been to Vail, you'll know that the shops that are there, it's designer clothing, it's very expensive art. It's not accessible and built for the everyday person. And so the people who live there, like us, our family, we didn't live directly in Vail. We lived in a town that was close. It's just kind of weird, right? And Brendan's going to talk a little bit later once we say goodbye to you, what it's actually like living in Vail, because that's where he lived. And, it's odd that we grew up in the same place, more or less, but we had a very different perception and a very different life experience and relationship to Vail. And that's why I wanted to bring you on, because we do have that familial tie to Vail. And
Yeah.
that's something that has always been really, really special to me. And so I'm glad that you could be on the show and share a little bit of that.
Well, I was just talking with my sister the other day, and she was telling me that her grandson and his family had just recently moved to the Vail Valley. And we still say Vail Valley, but even though they live down in Eagle now. And so a big thing in the early days when we were there is we always enjoyed at Fourth of July, the Fourth of July parade.
Yes.
And so my sister was telling her grandson that, okay, you must go on the 4th of July to the parade in Vail because that's what our family did. And so, of course, Gregory went and he said it was a lot of fun and that kind of thing. But, it's a long, long drawn out affair now. And it takes hours and and there's lots of people. Now, you go back to the time when we had our 4th of July parade in the early 70s. Well, the parade started at one end of town, went through town, and because it wasn't very long, it would just turn around and go back through it. And it was a fun time.
Yeah.
People there were just, a few local people there.
Right.
I remember we were getting license plates for our car. And in those early days, Colorado had 2 letters in the front, and then it was usually followed by 3 numbers afterwards. And so Eagle County was YM, the letters YM, and then it had, your 3 numbers. And then a few of the local people who had been there longer were starting to get a little bit irritated when we had to add another letter, and we had to go from YM to YN.
Oh, God forbid. You have to switch it up.
They were more than just a few hundred cars, driving around locally. So, yeah. It has changed. It's changed a lot, both summer and winter. So,
right. And we're going to get into what it's like as a kid growing up in a resort town. And, then eventually we moved out to a big city and life was different, right? Like our experiences changed. But thank you for coming on the show.
Okay.
Do you have any last remarks before we do our close off with you?
No, I would like to say one thing of why I personally always loved living in a resort. One of the reasons that I really enjoyed resort living is there was a hubbub to the season. The season would come and like the holiday times, the snow would start to come, and then the decorations, and I always loved that when the people came to town. It was busy, and it just seemed like it was really alive. And then you would have the season, there'd be little ups and downs and busier times and lulls. And then we'd get what we called mud season, and everybody would go.
Right.
And then it was done. And it was like, and Vail was literally a ghost town. You know, all the businesses shut down. Um, there was nobody walking around. You know, some maybe a stray dog or two, and there just wasn't much going on. And then we had in summertime, well, we had really the 4th of July weekend. And then there really wasn't a whole lot until, you know, the leaves came. And then we get a little bit of a weekend business when people would come up to look at the leaves and stuff. So summer was pretty quiet compared to the winter season in those earlier days. And then, you know, winter would come and it'd be back again. So that's the one thing that I really enjoyed about being in a resort, because it was like being in a real busy city for a short period of time. And then, you know, go out for a walk or go out for a ski and you're out in the woods, you know,
Yeah,
with
I think that's
wildlife.
so funny that you said that, because you're right. When when tourists are gone, no one's there. I mean, do you know the population of like active residents?
Yeah, it was when I looked it up, it's under 5,000.
Right. And that does that count people who have second homes, or maybe?
I don't think that includes second homes. I think it's like
Okay.
double if it's
Well,
included.
for anyone out there, oftentimes I'll tell people, yeah, I grew up in a town about, 5 to 7,000, and their jaws just drop. Like, people cannot fathom that size of a town. And so I just think it's funny that you say that when tourists came, it felt like a big city. Because you're right,
Yeah.
it like quadruples
I
or
remember
more.
I remember
Yeah,
learning
or
that
more.
they get between like 50 and 60,000, and that was a few years ago.
Which is huge. I mean, this area is small.
It's not a big geographic space for having that many people, so
Yeah, so that kind of helps ground you if you out there have never been to Vail, or don't kind of know what ski town resorts are like.
Mhm.
That's a perfect little wrap up for the
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. Because you have mud season, and then right before mud season, when the ski area closed and the tourists were gone, you'd have a couple of weeks there where you were still getting people driving up from Denver and that kind of thing. And so you had a little bit of weekend business, and then it just sort of dropped off.
Right.
And then right before the ghosts came out in town, it was, you know, all the seasonal workers. They were all leaving. And so you'd see all these little cars, you know, packed to the hilt with boxes and bags full of clothes, you know, with license plates from all over except Colorado. And all the seasonal workers were headed out.
Can
And
you
then it was dead.
yeah.
Then it was truly a ghost town.
Can you explain just point blank why seasonal workers are leaving? Because I want to kind of convey to the audience why like certain people can't afford to live. Like the
Well,
people who support the resort can't afford to live there.
well, you have different kinds of seasonal workers. You have the seasonal workers who are primarily young people or people who've just gotten out of college and they want to, you know, ski or something or snowboard for a year or
The ski
so.
bums.
The ski bums. We had them in the 60s and the 70s, and I think we still have them today. Um, and so once they leave, once their job ends, they leave. But then you have a lot of local people there who, you know, just really are probably struggling because, you know, it's expensive. Everything is expensive there, you know, not just your daily ski pass, but gasoline is more at the pump in Eagle County than it is, you know, in other areas of Colorado. Groceries are a little bit more. Rents are astronomical, and if you were to buy a house, you know, you'd have to have a lot of money just to buy a little basic house. Um, so people were working. A lot of people were working 2 and 3 jobs, and then you have, you know, the season ends. And what happens? Well, the people who are working in the hotels, the people who are working in the restaurants, the people who are working in the shops, the ski shops or the retail shops, you know, it's closed. The town closes down.
Right.
So a lot of those people are not working. So, you know, they have to live a little bit on their savings. until things pick up again. Fortunately now, the summer business is better. In the early days, there was very little summer business there. So, people really, really did struggle. But there weren't that many local people there. It was a small, small area. Um, um, it's expensive. And I think a lot of resorts have that type of um, stress for people who work there. I look at a lot of them, my coworkers who are teachers. Um, it's really tough to, live a comfortable lifestyle on a salary that's not commensurate with what some people in the valley are making, or those kind of people who are coming to visit there, or those people who have, um, you know, other homes and
Right.
not their primary home. So we used to laugh because, Claire, our family, we lived down in Eagle, and real estate was starting to get going a little bit more. There was more than just sort of local people living there. There were, some tourists starting to come in and stuff. And so some very young real estate person who I was having a conversation with was saying, "Oh, we've got people who are, buying second homes in this valley." And I go, "Yeah, there's down here in Eagle, they're starting to buy second homes." I said, "Up in Vail, there are no second homes. Those are third homes, fourth homes, fifth homes.
Right.
The second homes are down valley."
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, and just so you know, if you ever do a show about aliens
Yeah.
Yes.
from outer space,
Yes.
I would love to participate in that. Now, just so you know, I have never been abducted, but I would love to be.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Now I know where my obsession with aliens comes from. It's genetic. All right. Well, maybe in the future we will have to phone you in if you get abducted. We'll see.
Okay. All right. Okay.
All right. Bye, Dad. Okay. So now we have, as we said, our kind of boots on the ground or primary evidence has been submitted to what Vail was like in the early days. That's kind of what people call it, the early days of Vail.
Yeah.
So now we're going to move into what Vail was like for us, which is
In our day,
the modern day, the 2000s, because just for some reference, I was born in Vail. I lived there all my life, not in Vail, outside of it, in the Vail Valley. And, your story is a little different. You moved there.
Yeah, I moved there from Massachusetts when I was 10 years old. And I lived there until I was 22, more or less. And yeah, all I knew about that town was that it was a different place. It was in Colorado, and it had a huge mountain. And then the rest has just been me learning about it. So I have a very, I think, different perspective than you because of the context that we both have with Vail.
Right.
And so I remember when I first started talking to your dad, it felt like just like the historical floodgates opened up for what Vail was, because you hear bits and pieces, but it's very distilled or removed from the space that I was growing up in. Like mentioned every once in a while. Oh, existed since 1962. Okay, cool. That's
right. And I think also just as a kid, when you're living in a historically significant area and or resort town that has some sort of meaning outside of itself, you're not going to care. Why would a kid care?
To be honest, exactly. I didn't care as a kid.
Right.
Because I wasn't thinking about it.
To be honest, I don't think I really did either. It took me leaving it, going to college, to recognize, kind of what was so special and what I had growing up that, you don't have when you move to a city. But to just kind of lay the groundwork, I do want to kind of explain how the Vail Valley is laid out. So within the resort, there's two resorts. There's Vail and Beaver Creek, but we're going to talk about Vail for the sake of this episode.
Yes.
That is the hub of all things. So that's where the ski mountain is. That's where the lodges and the dining and the art, kind of all of that, all of the tourism bundled into one very, very small geographical area.
And for some kind of another way to describe it too is it's 3 highway exits, just like in this straight mountain corridor. So there's not a lot of north-southness to the valley. It is east-west and long. And anyone that's done a big road trip, when you have a long distance and it's like next 3 exits are this town, that's what it's like to drive in there. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's the other towns that the resort workers or the people who are actually supporting the functions of the resort live in, because they cannot afford to live in Vail itself, which is, we'll get into why that's such a problem.
Yeah.
And those are other towns that are just outside of it. So I think there's kind of 4. I'm not going to name them. You can Google them if you want.
Mm-hmm.
You can find that if you
so choose.
If you so choose. But, that's where the people running the lodges and the people running the restaurants and keeping the mountain operating. I mean, there's so many functions that have to be done. There's the ski instructors, people who operate the lifts, the lifties, ticket scanning, people who are running the rentals. It's a huge, huge operation. And if you're coming from the side of tourism, you're not going to understand that. You don't know who's running it. You don't know how much it takes to keep Vail's lights on, essentially, all day, every day during the winter and ski season. And so I can imagine that that's something that maybe you didn't understand as a kid, because, and I'll let you get into it, but you grew up in Vail. You grew up on that other side, more or less. And, there is that very obvious financial divide.
Yeah.
That I'd like to talk about, because I think that's very, very important when painting the picture of what it's like growing up in a resort.
Yeah. I came from a very different side of the valley. I was a ski racer the entire time, which is a very expensive sport. And it's a sport that involves a lot of equipment, travel. And so for me, my experience within the valley is I wouldn't be there for much longer than 3 months at a time at any given point for most of my teenage years. And so my perspective on it was, that's kind of where we went home and did the stuff that most kids are supposed to do. Because for me, just going home and attending classes regularly that felt way more normal to me. And I couldn't even look into the other weirdness of it, that I was missing so much school at any given point. But attending classes regularly was a breath of normalcy for me. Let's just paint that picture as it is. And so I think that my understanding of the valley, I felt like I didn't understand it at all, to be honest, while growing up. And it scared me how little I could understand that dynamic too. So to be honest, I felt much more comfortable when I was kind of out and about, where the identity of Vail itself was just a part of the team that I was on, rather than when I was actually there and understanding, why does this town exist? Why are the lift tickets so expensive? Why, why are these super, super fancy restaurants everywhere? Where is where are your chains for stuff? Why does it feel so separated from the town itself? And other things too. Why does the town look like the way it does? I grew up, or I was born in the East Coast. So a lot of my, the towns I was seeing and all that, they're East Coast based. And I was like, oh, is this just kind of what Colorado's like? Because I didn't know,
Of course.
So,
and you were so young.
Yeah. I like to. I think it's important for me to like forgive my earlier understanding of Vail because I was 10 years old. Like I was stoked on Mario and Sonic at the Winter Olympic Games on the Wii at that time. Like these
Same.
bigger picture things where I just wasn't aware of. That being said, I don't want for this to be like I hate Vail sort of thing. It's just I think that there is something really the way that privilege is described as blindness. There was a lot of blindness that I felt that a lot of it was like, and this is going to sound like a lame excuse, but it's like when there is that blindness to what's going on, to confront it changes too much of your current like world perspective. So a lot of people avoid it, and myself
you also
included.
Didn't grow up in a environment that promoted that or even wanted you to understand that privilege. And so
yeah, I mean, it's like everyone knew everyone, and it was isolated.
Yeah, but so did people on the other side of the valley, right? Yeah. It's like it is an isolating county, and we are so far apart. But these things that you say that you weren't aware of were so blatantly obvious on the other side.
Yeah.
And you talked about how, like, I didn't understand why Vail looked the way it did. And that's part of the reason I wanted my dad to kind of clear stuff up is like, hey, this ski town was founded by Europeans for Europeans.
Yeah.
It is where people from Austria, Germany, Switzerland, I'm going to throw in Finnish too because of my grandparents, could go and feel comfortable and feel accepted because as they had immigrated, into New York, they were met with such othering.
Yeah.
And I kind of felt that sense of othering is still in the valley.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to kind of live on the other side. And, all my friends and their families are helping keep the resort alive. So many of us worked at ticketing or, whatever. I mean, like my dad and I worked as like greeters for a while, which is where you just help these helpless tourists coming in, help feel excited, stuff like that. It's like, people who actually live in Vail don't give a shit. They don't even know that that's happening.
Yeah. Because
they're in this ridiculous bubble. And it's, as a child, you feel that. I mean, even, there's only a few schools in the valley, but there was such a line drawn in the snow, not the sand, that, we just didn't go over to where you were. I did not know anyone who went to your school, and I think you didn't really know anyone who went to my school. And luckily, we were able to meet when we were older.
Yeah.
But as kids, we never did because there's a financial divide that, children just don't mix. And, like you said, you're off doing skiing, which is a whole other can of worms. You're trying to do it competitively with the hope of getting into it professionally. Whereas kids on the other side of the valley are lucky if they can get one day pass.
Yeah.
And yet they're the ones supporting the resort. Like it's so twisted to me. And I understood that growing up, right? Because that divide was obvious. But it did take me growing older and moving away from Vail to really realize how sad it is. Because as my dad said, Vail's a really, really important town to my family's identity and existence. And when I see how kind of disgustingly commercialized it's become, it makes me so mad.
Yeah.
It's as far as like, okay, there was this movie theater called Cine Bistro, right? And it is, it's just flat out just ridiculous movie theater. It has, it has, the craziest cushions. You're getting nice food brought to you. It's not even like nice. Like the screens aren't even that big, but for some reason it's just like the most expensive movie theater ever. It's the same thing with the bowling alley there. Like it's ridiculously luxurious.
Yep.
And so, coming on the other side of the valley, like I always wanted that. I always wanted to be on the other side saying like, oh, I just went to Cinebistro, or I just went to bowl. But like, that's not possible. It's not feasible for the people who work there to enjoy those attractions or those events.
The thing that was strange about the town of Vail is if there was a bowling alley, it was a luxury bowling alley and dining concept. If there was a movie theater, it was one where people would deliver food to you in your chair at the theater in this luxury dining experience. So there wasn't the same level of casualness that, I don't know, I missed having just things that were a bit more casual and relaxed.
I think it's, the wealthy people who live in Vail, who brought all of this tourism, who I think are directly responsible for why Vail Resorts is the way that it is. That's the way they live. It's what they're expecting.
Yeah.
And, the average American isn't. Those are things you might do on a really fancy occasion or you're celebrating something. But for those experiences to be the normal is so odd. And I knew it, right? Like I knew it was weird, but I wanted it so badly because it's not what I had. And it was so close yet like so out of reach because it's not feasible. It doesn't make sense. And now that I'm an adult living elsewhere, paying for my own things, I get how like flat out ridiculous it is. Like, why would you spend $100 to go to the movie? I don't know. I could never justify that in my life. And I'm a film student. Like it's not something that makes sense.
There's so many things there that, and this is, I think, probably what's given me such cynicism for the way things are priced in general, right? Is a lot of the stuff in the Vail Valley plays into the idea, if it's expensive, therefore it's good.
Which is so not true. There's so much bad cuisine there.
Yeah, like
there's so much like
yes.
Like the thing is like there's all these fur coats and these just very very expensive designer shops, and it is so ugly. And you can spot the like wealthy tourists that just want to kind of fit that Vail look so quickly. Like it's a look. It is so obvious.
You know how you walk past the covered bridge, right? And the first shop on your left is a leather goods cowboy shop making like custom handmade pieces.
Oh, call it out by name.
Kimosabe.
Yeah, it's Kimosabe. And I think there's one in Aspen too. It's kind of a thing in these very wealthy resort towns. But that's what I'm trying to get at. There are no normal people stores.
Yeah.
And that's why we were talking earlier. It's like, it feels like Disneyland. Everything is presented to you in this beautiful picturesque way. And, you feel like you're in Austria, and the architecture is gorgeous. And a lot of the dining is Austrian, and let's go do après ski. And
the town itself is designed with so much of that. So yes, I want to expand on that, because you can do one-to-one comparisons between the way that Disneyland's walking paths are designed and the way that Vail is designed. And I can substantiate this because I have talked to people that work for the town of Vail, and they talked about this stuff. One thing that you will always notice in Disneyland and in Vail is that any way that you're walking, you can't see all the way to the end of, because they don't want you to feel like there's too much to walk. you're constantly kind of weaving through things and meandering. Right. Every road has a little curve.
And that keeps it all looking really picturesque and nice. Because I'll just say it, when you get out of Vail, which the tourists never do, like they come to the resort and never leave, it doesn't look like that, right? Like we are, the valley is surrounded by so much beautiful scenery. It's not that, but you know, there's kind of a strip mall-y-esque look to some of it, and some of these towns don't look as nice. Once you get into them, I'll say they're very, very nice to live in. Yeah. Right? Like the town I grew up in, I absolutely love. I didn't when I was younger, but now looking back, I'm like, my God, that place was beautiful. But it doesn't look like it from the outside, but Vail does. Yes. Even from I-70, it's got that massive curb appeal. It's like, you know when you're in Vail. Yeah. And that's the Disneyland effect, because Disneyland's designed in the same way that you can't see out of it. Because out of it, really Anaheim is not a pretty place. Yeah. Right? It's actually got a lot of issues. But once you're in Disneyland, you feel like you've been transported, and there's so much peace and happiness. And Vail's the exact same way. But it didn't used to be that way. Well, like, it was a safe haven. It was a good, happy place for people to be joyous and just ski and feel like they're back home. Yeah. But now it's a freaking, you know what? It's a freaking joke, because it is so, like, you can only appropriate European culture so much until it's like, it is so phony, right? It's like, you'll look at some architecture and you just, like, I often wonder, like, who had to painstakingly put that up?
Especially when they do the, I was going to say architecture and like the not seeing out. I want to actually add to that, because people that know about Disneyland, one of the things is they make it so you can only see the park from the inside. It's very intentional. And the big eyesore or source of noise pollution or source of any sort of tomfoolery and shenanigans in the resort itself is I-70. So they have now built up so many developments that it's effectively this big wall that hides or obstructs almost all of I-70 through that Vail corridor.
And for those who haven't been there, you can just Google Vail Village images and it'll all pop up. I've kind of seen like the TikToks of, oh, it would be such a dream to be an X for Christmas. And like Vail and Beaver Creek are brought up a lot. And I will say it is a freaking dream during Christmas. It is so...
They pull out all the stops.
They pull out everything.
Oh my goodness. It's crazy.
Gorgeous. But then any other time, I'm so sick of it. Like it's so exhausting to live in a place that is constantly kind of catering to wealthy people. To me, it's exhausting. There's no other way to put it, because like as much as you work day in and day out and you're trying to help these like kind of ridiculous people that come and live there, you're never going to have it yourself. Like you will never make enough to even get close.
Yes.
And that's the really, I think, evil part of resort towns. And I think this applies to kind of any resort town. Like you could apply it to Hawaii, Disneyland, lots of other places. It's the same everywhere. Ours is just happens to be with a ski town. But it's so hard because skiing, the sport itself, you know, I love it. It's so unique. And I think there are a lot of really, really small, like family mountains that people can get to where there's a different culture around skiing. But in Vail and Aspen, it's become so elitist that it's just not fun anymore.
Another, I think, point that highlights that is that when we think about, okay, how are people getting to and from Vail? And because, I mean, that's a big part of it, is if you're going to be in this Hollywood-esque class of people and visit, and I remember the buzz that would happen when It was known that certain celebrities were in.
Oh my! Do you remember when the Kardashians
Yeah,
came?
people were going feral.
I
Like all my
remember.
friends were like, "We're gonna find them."
Yeah,
And I'm
like we all left
"Jeez."
school and we're
Yeah.
hunting for them, and oh my gosh,
Kardashian hunt. Yeah,
yeah. But it wasn't just that. It's, Aspen's kind of known as the celebrity hill, right? Like,
Yeah.
everyone goes there. But
Winter Hollywood.
Winter Hollywood. But people who want to stay off the record or kind of more,
Yeah.
Do their own thing, or just like billionaires and like very wealthy people, they're going to Vail. They're not going to Aspen.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I was going to say is the commonality between the two, but also the difference at the same time is, let's look at the Aspen airport and let's look at the Eagle airport, right? The Eagle airport is the closest airport to Vail. It is the premier landing strip for any private jet that is going to and from Vail.
That's what it was built for.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's just far enough from the resort. It's just obscured enough where it's difficult to keep track of the comings and goings of people, because most people don't have eyes in both locations. Whereas Aspen's airport is so like incorporated within the town that those, like when a jet lands, it's displayed until it leaves. Like it is so much more flashy. So I mean, even in the way that I guess the both are designed, one's designed for more obscure, like secrecy, slide into the town, enjoy yourself and leave. And the other is very flashy, like, look, I'm in Aspen.
Right. But
yeah.
And I agree. There's a difference. I think different people go to Aspen and Vail for a reason, right? But
same shit, different shapes.
Yeah, it's still the same thing. And like, first of all, if you can afford to live in Vail, my God, what did you do to get there? Second of all, like, if you can afford to just have that be a regular family vacation, because there's people that will come there every year.
Yeah.
Right. And like, we kind of know the type that does that. It's insane because it's not like they're spending $1,000. They're spending several $1,000s a day.
Yeah.
Per person. Like, it is not something that you can just up and say, oh, I'm going to go to Vail. Really?
Just I remember when they were really, like, I mean, growing up there, you kind of also get a sense of when they're trying different, like, little businessy bits.
Mm-hmm.
You see all the price changes year over year, all the, like, how are we going to attract new people here? And one of the bits that they were doing, and it's ironic now that, like, the day pass is $300, right? They want to promote people getting onto or in the resort as much as possible, so that they can, like, make less on the ticket itself in exchange for making more on everything that it takes to just exist there. The burgers, the hot chocolate, the fry, like it's the same way you go to Disneyland and you go to get some food and you're like, wow, I've been robbed, but my goodness, I like the pickle.
Yeah, like that's what they're making their money on, is what it takes for people to live and survive and on their vacation, because you can't just survive on a lift ticket. You have to eat and you have to sleep somewhere.
Exactly. And it's like, okay, well, if we have to sleep somewhere, like, just right now, hit up Expedia or whatever and just take a look. What would it cost to have a night in Vail around Thanksgiving? Just peruse. And
that's kind of when the mountain opens. But also, like, Christmas
is nuts.
January, February. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to be honest, because I'm going to be honest too.
Yeah.
Growing up in Vail, what was your perception of kind of the other side of the valley, right? And these are the towns that I'm talking about that support the resort. What did you think of the people who live there? Because you've kind of talked about how you lived in a bubble, you lived in very, very small area. Most of the people you went to school with, or just general people that you knew in your life, lived there as well, and or very close. But there's another side to Vail.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you were aware of it to a degree, right? You had to know that there were other towns there.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think about that growing up?
It was it was confusing growing up, because, you know, I think that it's one of those things where you have an idea of what the world is like, but it is taught to you through the lens of people that know a very specific sliver of the world. And so there's a lot of like what is valued from the valley that I grew up in is way different than that of the rest of the valley. Like there were certain things that just like luxuries to normal people were just casually like talked about. And
Can you kind of quantify that? 'Cause
Yeah.
I want to make sure that that's true, right? Because I'm coming from the other side.
Yeah.
I have had my own perception of the people
Mhm.
who lived in Vail. And I kind of want to use this as an opportunity to see, like,
Yeah, when I grew up, I couldn't understand. I was trying to figure out why I had such a difficult time relating to the kids around me. And a lot of it, I think, was based off of just the, like, when growing up and money is not an issue at all, your ability to relate to other people about something that dictates so much of everyone's life just goes away. And so the things that are valued are like, it's like beyond money sort of stuff, where it is now, it's a lot of like everyone hops around trends and that sort of stuff. But I remember once walking into like, you know, a house in Vail that was one of my friends, and I was wearing a puffy jacket that had like a hole that I duct taped up on, right? And like I got comments about like the state of the jacket itself because it was like, oh, there's a hole in that. I'm like, yeah, but look, it's all fixed up and it's super warm. Like I couldn't understand why there were certain things that were like weird to do.
Why they wouldn't think to fix the hole.
Yeah.
I think there's 2 reasons. 3 reasons. It looks ugly. Why would you keep wearing it?
Mm-hmm.
2, I don't know how to fix it because I've never had to fix something in my life. And 3, why would I fix it when I can just buy a brand new one right now?
Yeah. And that was like, there was a lot of that sort of dynamic where I was like trying to figure out like, what is, you know, what even is money? What is that sort of stuff around people that money is a tool to invest. Money is a tool to like grow and like, you know, kind of have a lot of control over the situation in your own life. Like you can buy your way through, I think, a lot of situations. And you can buy your way to a lot of certain ideal living scenarios. You can buy your way out of problems. I mean, and so when you're living in this, like, a lot of stuff is distilled place, you start to see how like the culture growing up and talks about people that don't have what they have. And it's the, like, there's a lot of blaming other people's situations on like a moral failure while being oblivious to the fact that there is this like wealth hoarding going on. And it's just constant othering of people for things that they're just kind of, they don't know about. I mean, it's interesting trying to remember now what was valued the most. There's a lot of things like, I mean, the way that people were speaking about colleges and universities, I like today it would make me sick to be in one of those conversations, but at that time it was so normal to, I mean, just to absolutely look down on universities and colleges all the time. Just like truly the most despicable elitism going on. And it wasn't even like people weren't even doing their due diligence to understand why they held those beliefs. It was the idea that if my child can get into this kind of school or university, it's an extension of me and my success. It was never about like no one talked about, oh, this, college is literally doing studies on XYZ and my kid loves it. Like, for example, fossils. Like, there are some colleges out there that are like, oh yeah, it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, but they might have like incredible research on fossils. And, you might have a kid that's just passionate about that. And like, that wouldn't be valued there.
It also isn't like allowed. And I want to speak on that a little too. So you're kind of referring to people in Vail.
Yeah.
Have a tendency to look down on schools like state schools, right? These are really, really great universities that statistically the majority of Americans that attend a university are going to a state school and or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? Not many people are going to the Ivies.
Yeah.
But then it goes deeper than that. Because on my side of the valley, where I went to school, most of the people who, if they were going to go to college, they probably were going to go to the community college because that's what we had there. And it's a really good community college. Like, it's a great system that, you could at least get your first 2 years out of the way, not pay that much, and then maybe think about going to a state school, right? And so that's what was pushed in my school because they were just hoping to kind of give kids a chance to kind of get out, more or less. And then there were kids like me who I ended up going out of state because that's what I wanted. I wanted to have that big city experience.
Yeah.
And I also had the means to do so.
I actually want to, because that reminds me of something really explicit. It's that I remember how much the community college was looked down on. Like, oh God, it was terrible. I mean, I had such a misconstrued understanding of what a community college was because of it. Like, that's something that I didn't know how truly off I was, because all I knew was from what people told me about it. And it was that this was a place, if you can't get anywhere or in anywhere else, this is where you go. This is like
I think it's even worse than that. It's like, this is the school for the poor kids. This
and it could have been very coded into that too, where it's like they can't explicitly say something like that, but that was probably the perception. But
I feel like a lot of resort towns too, like if you're from Hawaii or, God, I'm trying to think of like other elitist places in the US, but something like that, where it's like a certain population of typically very, very wealthy white people move in, and then they kind of, they're in their own bubble. They have their own way of doing things. And then the people who are already there hurt because of it. And then they have to like work to keep those people happy, but then their cost of living goes up and like their life experience changes so much. And so if anyone out there can relate to that, or I don't know, just kind of knows what we're talking about, I hope this is getting through to you, because yes, like there's an aspect of resorts that is so fun to grow up in. Like, we always had something kind of interesting outdoorsy to do, but then there were these social and economic layers that are so difficult for children to understand, because these tones you feel from, I was born there, it was always there, it's something I always felt, but I didn't understand why. I didn't, kids don't understand things because they can't grasp the idea of money because they're not paying for things yet themselves.
Yeah.
And so it took both you and I leaving that area to kind of go, oh my God, what is going on over there? Like, it's kind of insane. And it sucks because, there's so much to love about the Vail Valley. There are so many beautiful, wonderful aspects of it, and really, really amazing people live there. This is not a hate on Vail episode. This is kind of a, hey, like, you need to wake up a little bit. Like, this is the reality of what resorts do to people. And, it's just another way that the 1% is actively harming people around them. And they do it in such a non-obvious way that it kind of just creeps in over time, right? Like, from when my dad was talking about how Vail was gradually growing, and then Vail Resorts hit, and boom, all this development, prices go up, gas goes up, cost of living is insane. Like, you'll have to pay $1 million for a basic small home, but to the people who are moving in there, like, $1 million is nothing, right? It's this out of touch thing that it is so hard to grasp. And it's just, to me, so sad how it affects the kids that live there.
It's, you described it so well. It is a very complicated social and economic dynamic that, like, I can barely grasp growing up there. So it's like, I would imagine outside looking in, if you have a fresh set of eyes, if you've seen stuff like this before, it's probably like, oh yeah, it's obvious, it's this.
Right.
But growing up in it, it's weird.
Well, and you have to remember, in rural towns, oftentimes people are born there and they never leave.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there are multi-generational families, not in Vail. That's a different thing, but in the towns outside of it, a lot of kids I knew had never even been on a plane. They're not understanding or seeing how other places work and the dynamics of other towns. And so the Vail Valley is all they really know. And so when you're in that your whole life, why would you think that it isn't normal? And I remember growing up just feeling uncomfortable, feeling like I wanted to leave. And when I was little, I thought it was just because it was too small. It's too rural. Like, I want to go shopping. I want to go be in a city and see other people that are different than me. And I'm sure that was a part of it. But the other part of it, I don't think I was old enough or mature enough to really grasp. And I still don't think I am. Like, I'm still learning. Like you said, we are kind of starting to unravel that, or peel back that onion.
Yeah, because I do remember, though, there being kind of this distinct line that was like set up where it was, you have Vail the resort and Vail the town. And those were two opposing forces a lot of the time. Not always. I mean, like, they worked together.
What do you mean by that? Are you saying like the Vail the town is like the locals who...
No, like
normal?
Like, or the literal system of government that technically has an element of control in that town. It's like the resort itself is a business, right? You have the business entity, and
Vail
then you
Resorts.
have Vail Resorts is the business, and then you have the town of Vail, which is different because that is your local government, and that is what keeps things like. If a pothole gets paved, it's because of the town of Vail, not Vail Resorts. Vail Resorts isn't doing any of that. And so there's this weird dynamic between the two of, like, Vail Resorts will try and do, like, as much as they do already, there is even stuff being filtered on what they want to do with that town based off of just even a local government. Like, so it's like you have that internal tension, and then you amplify that to the nth when you go outside of it too. So that's where it gets like layers and layers and layers of just, because
I can see that, but also I do think that the town of Vail has incentive to more or less give Vail Resorts what they want.
Yes.
And that is
agreed.
Probably why Vail has become so ridiculous and so out of touch. Not the only reason, it's a factor.
They are more collaborative than...
Yeah. I thought you were going to say there's a divide between like the old people of Vail, because there are still some like original people and some families that they might have profited and done well because of the businesses they started there, but they still kind of know the difference and remember what it used to be like.
Yeah.
Versus the newer money or the developers, or even just, kind of prominent, notable families that have moved in and, like you said, don't even really know what Vail is, don't understand, or honestly, I'm going to say even care about how important the history of Vail.
With this bigger perspective on the mountain town of Vail and all of its history, what is something that you either learned while we have been filming this or have learned recently about that feels, I don't know.
Yeah.
Feels like a big deal to you?
So, for anyone who knows me or knew me while I was growing up in Vail, they would know that I always wanted to get out. I was never really happy there. And once I was able to get out, things changed and I got that perspective, realized, hey, it probably wasn't actually that bad. But I think I'm just learning that those feelings that I felt were grounded in something. And as a kid, I was trying so hard to understand why I was so uncomfortable. And it's not a literal translation, right? It's not like I could say, oh, Vail Village makes me sick, right? It wasn't that. It was I'm waking up every day and I feel like I have no idea who I am because I can't relate to anyone who lives here. And when you're growing up in such a small town and you feel that, it not only is it like extremely isolating, but it's so scary. Because in a city, you can kind of find your people. Because there's so many people. There's many different walks of life, but in small towns there isn't, and it's kind of cut and dry. For our instance, there was one side of the valley and there was the other. And you didn't cross it. And so what I had was my side of the valley, and I just didn't feel like I fit in. And I kind of had this want to be on your side. And I think a lot of people who grow up in resorts can relate to that. Now, I absolutely want nothing to do with it, right? It's kind of the antithesis of who I am. But when you see the people you love and your friends and, just kind of your people constantly serving the other side, you one day want to have the chance to be the other side. That's a natural thing for a kid to want. I don't want to be angry with my past self for thinking that because I was a kid. But now as an adult, I can say, hey, the social lines and the economic lines in Vail is really, really evil. There is something so twisted about that place. And you wouldn't know it by looking at it because it is quite simply one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life. And I'm lucky to have lived there, but I also learned a lot because of that a lot of people I don't think would understand. It kind of messes with your identity. And that's tough for kids. I think if I was older and I chose to move there, like a lot of people graduate and they'll go, like my dad said, be a ski bum. It's an appealing lifestyle. I might view it differently. But I wasn't. I was a child. And having to navigate that terrain, it's weird. That's what I learned.
I think that my learning about the Valley, I always felt that there is pressure to be cordial and kind to everyone, no matter what, because it was such a small community that I knew passed judgment really harshly on people, that you had to kind of play the game of being an appealing person. And so when I was seeing people in my life push against that appeal, they were so quickly ostracized, made to feel less than. Just, yeah, it was kind of horrible to see what happens when you disobey the social contract of that place. And for me, I didn't want to feel like I was contributing malice to the space that I was in. I always want to feel like I am giving more than I take. And it was impossible for me to find how that worked within where I was living. So I think the lesson I've taken with all of this is I think what's scariest but most exciting for me is that what on paper people desire isn't usually what is most meaningful to them. And so for me, being in an environment that has on paper all the things that I should desire, but feeling unfulfilled and feeling bad, like I had no sense of self. It's exciting, but a bit terrifying to know that means that there's something else out there for me that does appeal. The scary part is finding out what it is, and what gets me excited. And so I've been in the process of figuring that out. I mean, this podcast helps me kind of work through that and tapping into parts of me that aren't in the, thinking about school grades, college, skiing, and going more into like, who do I want to be as a person? I think it's been a challenge, but I'm happy that I have that opportunity right now. Even though the circumstances around it aren't all picturesque, like having that opportunity means a lot to me. So yeah, I mean, kind of a long-winded way of saying I'm thankful to be where I'm at now, despite some of those more complicated ideas being very difficult for me to deal with, and find a way out of, find guidance through. So, yeah.
It seems like we both kind of landed in a similar spot, even though we had very different lives growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And we weren't that far apart from each other, but it was different. You and I both had this desire to leave. And I think a lot of people did, but not everyone has the chance to.
Yeah.
And so I'm thankful for that, but I'm also, proud of the both of us for being able to leave and then kind of starting that new life and then going back and reflecting.
Yeah.
Because I do think growing up in that valley made me who I am today. I'm sure it's a similar feeling for you. I had certain lessons that I had to learn just because I lived there. that I might never have confronted in my life if I didn't, right? Like, I had to confront why I wanted material possessions in the way that I did. I had to confront why I was so uncomfortable being agreeable. You talked about that.
Yeah.
You said you kind of felt the opposite, but I couldn't stand being agreeable because I felt so tied down in that valley. And if I grew up in a city, who knows? I could be a very different person. And so Vail is a big part of my identity, both like familial with my grandparents, but it's where I was born. It's where I grew up, and a lot of my family too. And so that's never going to be something that leaves me. So I'm thankful for the time I had there. It's been enough. I don't need to go back. But I'm also really thankful for who I am today because of the lessons that I was forced to learn there. I think that about wraps up our experience living in Vail. I hope some of you out there could at least learn something from this, see if you could relate in any way, even if you didn't grow up in a resort town. I think a lot of the emotions we went through and described are pretty applicable to any town that has some sort of wealth divide. So I hope you all enjoyed this. And if you've been to Vail or are planning to go to Vail, let us know what you think about it. I'm curious what some other opinions out there are.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.
Bye.